All right, I'm going to get started. My name is Jamie Casap. I work for Google. I've been at Google for about 6.5 years, which makes me a really old man at Google. We have a tool internally called Percent, and we can determine how long other people have been at Google longer or shorter than we have been, and 94% of the people at Google started after I started. So I live here in Phoenix. Actually, I like to say I spend my weekends here in Phoenix. I live on airplanes, and I travel around the world, and I'm responsible for what we do in education from a technology perspective at Google. And so I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things that are going on and some of the things that we're seeing in this space, because I get a chance to spend a lot of time with the schools and how technology is affecting education. Okay, any teachers? You guys teachers? Okay, cool. Talk to lots and lots of teachers. This is cool. This is actually very intimate. You guys can ask questions as I go. Usually I have like these big giant auditoriums, and it's hard to like look at people because the lights are on you. So this is good. I like this very intimate conversation that we can have. So one of the things that is interesting. First of all, this is my contact information. If you don't have it, they're my daughter likes to say emails for old people. So tweeting, Google Plus, and then I also write a blog on education as well. That I kind of cover all the different things that are going on in education reform. All right, so these are the things that I kind of want to cover. By the way, this is a presentation that I've done for mostly this deck is mostly for folks that are in the leadership space in education in terms of getting them to think about different ways of looking at things. So that's kind of what we're going through. And so the first thing is kind of to talk about education as an opportunity, as opposed to all the negativity that we have around education. And the idea is that education can be the silver bullet for families. And I know this from a personal perspective because this is where I grew up. I grew up in Hell's Kitchen in New York. I'm a first-generation American. Grew up on welfare, single mother, all the statistics. And then I think about my two kids, and my 20-year-old and my 11-year-old. This is when you're supposed to say I don't look like I have a 20-year-old. So my 20-year-old and my 11-year-old, and the fact that I used to wake up and not have electricity or deal with all the social service issues or deal with caseworkers and complain about it. Now those were my complaints as a kid. I think about my 11-year-old complaining about waking up on weekends and having to do a system update on his PlayStation 3 before he plays Call of Duty on his 55-inch television set, right? And that's good. That's exactly what I want. He has no idea what poverty is. Has no idea. I'm not worried about him. My daughter's in her second year of college. She never asked if she had to go to college. I never told her she had to go to college. She just assumed she was going to college. She assumed she was going to graduate school. She also assumes I'm paying for it, but that's a good problem to have, right? That's the whole point, is that we want that for our kids. And so education can be that social and economic, we can have a social and economic benefit from education, and that's really critical to keep in mind and why it's important for us to focus on. But the difference is that, this is where I work, and the job that I currently do didn't exist when I graduated high school, right? And education was set up for this industrialized world where we were building factory workers, and we're building managers, and we're building bankers, and we're doing all these different things, but we live in a different world today. So how do we prepare kids for a job that we can't even define yet, right? And that's actually critical, what we gotta look at. And we know that there's a magic line, that high school graduation line, right? We gotta get kids to graduation. We know what happens economically and socially if you don't graduate from high school, but not only getting them to that magic line, we have to get them beyond that line. We have to get them into some kind of post-secondary education, whether it's college, whether it's community college, whether it's trade school, and what's cool about technology and what we're seeing in this space is that if you look at that other alternative, we haven't defined that yet, right? Are kids going to be able to kind of define what their own post-secondary education looks like by taking classes with Coursera or building their own courses or creating their own curriculums post high school, right? So these are the things that we have in front of us that we're looking at. So, but we understand that the jobs of the future are going to require more than a high school graduation. And so what we're doing in education is we're seeing a paradigm shift. And we've seen this in lots of different areas. Like I use this picture because this is, happened this week. But the whole idea of bringing technology into the world and all the different paradigm shifts that happen when we do that, right? So this is a picture of the election. CBS in 1952 when they brought in anybody know this computer? You guys familiar with this? The UNIVAC. Right. So they brought this computer into the elections, and it caused a whole bunch of waves in terms of we don't want this technology in. It's not going to be predictable. It's going to take our jobs. You know, all these different things that you hear with bringing in this technology, and to the point where the UNIVAC actually predicted the winner of the election in like the first 13 minutes of the election, and no one actually called it that way. They were all scared that it was going to be wrong. It just didn't make human sense. And it's funny, we kind of went through this a little bit this week, depending on what station you were watching. But you know, we went through this, like, is this real or is this not real? Can you imagine watching elections and not using technology, not using computers to do the data models and all the things that they did with the election results? We've seen this paradigm shift in lots of different industries. You know, if you think about the photography, if you look at your grandfather's pictures or your great-grandfather's pictures, depending on how old they are, and if they have photographs, they look like oil paintings, because photographs were taken and looked like oil paintings when they were first introduced into society. And then eventually, look what we're doing with photography today, and the evolution and the innovation that's happening in photography. Same thing with motion pictures. Motion pictures, if you look at the first motion pictures that were created, it was literally melodrama theater, right? That was recorded. And it replaced that. So we're seeing that right now. That's where we are right now with education and what we're doing with technology. And I think it makes sense because if you think about how old the technology is, it's not very old, right? I always like to remind folks that it wasn't that long ago that we used to have to call the internet. Right? We used to have to make phone calls to the internet, and the internet was like, the hot high school girl. She was really, really rude. She wouldn't call you back. Sometimes she wouldn't pick up the phone. Sometimes she hung up on you all the time. It was that kind of experience. You had this terrible experience with the web. And what was our reward? Our reward when we got online at 96 kilobytes a second was that we were picking up, websites that had pages, that had links to pages, that had links to pages, and that's all it was. And think about what we're doing today on the web and all the things that we're doing in this space. So it makes sense that education hasn't been able to keep up because it's been moving way too fast. And education is slowly catching up. You guys think about the fact that it took us 38 years to get to 50 million users using television. Using radios, and 13 years to get to 50 million users that use TVs. And it took Angry Birds Space Edition 11 days to get to 50 million users, right? So it probably will take Angry Birds Star Wars like 2 days to get to 50 million users, right? So that's the pace of technology and innovation that's happening in the space. So it makes sense that it hasn't been able to keep up. Add to that the fact that this is a generation that is growing up with technology all around them, right? Technology is part of their lives. They're born into the technology. It's not anything magical to them. Where a smartphone is still magical to us, to a kid it's just a phone, right? I mean, we don't walk into a room and flip on the lights and say, oh my God, it's a miracle, right? But our great-grandparents are like, you guys are lucky, right? So that's the kind of experience that we're in. So the technology's not new to this generation. Again, if you think about it from a different perspective, I like to remind folks that if you look at a 5-year-old or a 7-year-old, the worst technology that they'll ever see in their life is an iPad 1, right? That's their Commodore 64, right? That's the worst technology they'll ever see is an iPad 1. They'll look back at an iPad 1 the way we look back at Commodore 64, right? That's the pace that we're moving at. So this is a generation that's growing up with technology all around them. But at the same time, we have to be careful in education because I'm starting to see this trend where we think that these kids are superhuman, right? We're saying kids today can do X, kids today can multitask, kids today can do all these different things. You can do a search for students and multitasking. You see all these positive articles about how students can multitask. And the truth is they can't multitask, right? Evolution hasn't happened that fast. They do 4 things poorly, right? So what they do though, what we do have to pay attention to is not necessarily looking at them as they're some kind of subhuman or superhuman, depending on your point of view. We have to look at them in terms of how they learn how to do things is different than the way we learn how to do things. And that's critical to understand because we learn how to do things, and I remember this when I was in school, was the concept was learn how to do something as you're going to teach it, right? Learn how to do it as you're going to teach someone else how to do it. So it makes sense that that's what we do. But when you think about the kids today, they're doing things, learning things in a completely different way, right? I think about the fact that my daughter, we were in Hawaii and we bought a ukulele for my daughter, and we're walking out of the store and I saw that they had instruction books and videos on how to play the ukulele. And I said, hey, do you want to buy an instruction book or a video? And she looked at me like I was from outer space, right? And I'm a cool guy, you know. I work at Google, right? So I think I'm hip, and my daughter looked like I'm insane. And so, how is she gonna learn how to play ukulele? YouTube videos, right? She's gonna watch YouTube videos. She's gonna find 10 people that are gonna teach her to play one song, and she's gonna find the right person out of those 10 to teach her how to play that song, right? So, completely different way than the way we learn how to do things. This is a picture of my 11-year-old from just a couple weeks ago. I'm sitting over here to the left of him, and I'm being a good American on a Sunday. I'm being lazy and I'm watching football, right? So I'm sitting there watching football, and I turn to my left and I see this. Right? This is what I'm looking at. He's supposed to be watching football with me, and this is what I see. So here he is. He's playing Minecraft on this machine. You guys are familiar with Minecraft, right? Yeah, I mean, we can get into a whole half-hour discussion on the graphics of Minecraft and how we used to call them Atari 2600, but that's a whole other discussion, right? So we got him, he's over here playing Minecraft on this machine, and then on this machine, on his Chromebook, he's actually watching videos on how to play Minecraft while he's playing Minecraft, right? And nobody prompted him to do this. No, this is him. This is how he learns. And nobody says to him, hey, listen, learning happens, no, stop. Because learning only happens between Monday and Friday, between 8 and 3, and between this month and this month. These kids are learning on a consistent basis. This is the world that they live in, right? And we have to realize that even for us, the net, the web is where we get our resources, right? The web is where our resources come from. And you know, think about the last time you saw a 12-year-old say, you know, I need to figure something out. Where are the encyclopedias? I mean, when was the last time we did that, right? So even though we're in that world, we don't recognize it, that we are literally using the web to manage all our resources, right? We have our banking account, we have our mortgages, we have our lives online, and we don't even realize it. But for a kid, that's all they know. Their resources live on the web, and their relationships do as well, right? Their relationships, even though they have face-to-face personal, my kid still goes and plays, you know, in the yard with his friends on the same block. They still do that, but they manage those relationships online more than they would have managed them face-to-face. Even, you know, the way they communicate with each other. I mean, when was the last time you saw two 12-year-olds talk on the phone to each other? Right? They text each other. So it's a completely different way. So they manage their relationships online, and, you know, unlike us who joined Facebook, you know, late, some of us joined it late in the game, and we signed up and we looked up all our high school friends because we wanted to see how much better we were doing than they were. And we wanted to see whether Sally got fat, and we wanted to see whether or not, you know, those two that were hooked up in high school and got married ever divorced. You wanted to find all that stuff out. And then 3 months later, we realized after reading all their posts, oh my God, how do I get rid of these people? Because I didn't want to hook up with them in the first place, right? I realized why I'm not friends with them. Well, I think about my 20-year-old who will never be able to get rid of her high school friends, right? Her high school friends are always going to be part of her life. And so we have to figure out how to make sure that we're teaching kids how to be good digital citizens and how to be digital leaders, so that their reputation, what they share online, what they post online, all that becomes part of their of who they are and what they do. And if you look at what we're doing instead, this is kind of what you see. And this is a picture from a couple weeks ago from the New York Times about kids. The story was about how these old, you know, buses and ice cream trucks are now being turned into cash cows for schools. They park in front of schools, and kids check in their technology for $1 a day, right? And because they're not allowed to bring their technology into school. And think about what that means. I look at this picture and I think, what would happen if one of our great thinkers of the world came back? Plato, Newton, Einstein, and they saw this, right? What would their reaction be? You know, their reaction is, wait a second, the world's information is in this little tiny black box, and you're making them check it at the door, right? Why aren't you using that? Why aren't you using that to educate them, right? So that's the world that we currently live in. But the good news is that we're starting to see some advantage, or some schools take advantage of technology as a tool in what they're doing in education. So we want to see more of an interaction between the technology and the students and what they're learning, and we're starting to see more of that and more like this. But the problem is that, and I'll talk about this in a minute, that how do you scale? How do you go from 30 machines in a classroom? How do you go from just a little use of technology to a whole lot of use of technology? And that's what we're kind of focused on. But before we get there, I could kind of cover the skills that we think kids need, and especially at Google, the things that we look for when we're hiring people, because this is what we need to focus on, right? They need to know some cognitive things, they need to know some content, but how do we build these skills around it? And these are the way I call them out: communication, collaboration, critical thinking, analyzing information, and problem solving. You've seen this in different formats. They're 21st century skills, or my friend Tony Wagner calls them survival skills, and there's different ways that you can call these things out. I don't like the idea of 21st century skills. I don't like to use that phrase, because first, I have no idea what century we're in now, no clue. And if you think about that concept, it feels like it's something in the future. You're preparing kids for the future. And these are skills that kids need right now in school, when they're in kindergarten or when they're in first grade. They need to start building these skills. And how we communicate has dramatically changed, right? When I was in school, when I was graduating college, I'm a WordPerfect 5.1 guy, right? That's the world that I graduated from, and I saw the Windows 3.0 world coming in, and I thought, whoa, the expectations and how we kids communicate is dramatically going to change, right? Because my communication was, I made things on WordPerfect 5.1, I printed them on my dot matrix printer, and I used overhead transparencies to do my presentations, right? And that was complicated enough. This new world with interactive media and all these different things, we're going to come in and change how you're supposed to communicate with each other. And the truth is, it hasn't really changed. I teach classes at ASU, and I go sit in other classes that professors ask me to come sit in, especially in the MBA program. They do a business case on Google, and so I go sit and I watch the kids do their presentation on Google, and I've been doing this for 6 years. And every semester it's the same thing. There's 4 kids. They get up, they do the presentation, they split up the 20 slides into 4 or 5 each, and they go through it, and they literally take the business case and put it on PowerPoint slides with 12 bullet points and spit it back out to me. And it's the same every single time. How do we communicate has dramatically changed. We have to teach kids how to do everything from writing a critical, original thought white paper to how to communicate that white paper in 140 characters, right? And everything in between on a global scale, not just in English, for example, right? So we have to look at the whole world and not just your classroom. Collaboration has dramatically changed, and it's as important. It's one of those words we've been using forever, but school is a very individualized sport, right? Kids get a grade, kids are in class, kids do X, and then we push them out the door and we say, good work, go work with others, right? And imagine as a teacher, you hand out a test to your 5th graders, and they're doing their test, and at the end of the test, 2 kids come up holding the test together, and they look at you and they say, we did this together. What was your reaction? Right? Why is collaboration cheating? Right? Why is collaboration cheating? It doesn't make any sense. When in my world, I can't imagine going off to Sundar or Larry and saying, here's the global education strategy for 2013, with a smirk on my face saying, I did it all by myself. No, all proud. Nobody helped me. My parents didn't help me. Nope, I didn't ask anybody. He's up there asking me, well, did you talk to these guys? Nope. I did it all by myself. Like, that's the world we live in, and we're preparing kids in a completely different way. So we have to figure out how to use technology in a very collaborative way. We also have to start getting kids to think and not just memorizing things, right? I mean, this is a critical thing. The abundance of information is in our pockets. We have to realize that, right? I thought one of the benefits of being a parent would be that I could just make things up, right, whenever I wanted to. And now I got my 11-year-old vetting everything I say, right? So if he questions me even for a split second, he's reaching into his pocket and pulling it out the world and calling me out on something, right? And it's to the point where we had to have a conversation about no, President Lincoln started the Gettysburg Address was in 1963 or 1863, and we're having these discussions and debates because he's able to get to that information. So how do we get people to start processing their information? And then in the same kind of vein, how do we get them to make sense of the information that's out there, right? We have to realize that most of us, and I've seen the data, are absolutely terrible searchers. We suck, right? If you type a question mark into the search bar, you're a terrible searcher, right? And so if we're bad searchers, how are our kids searching? How are we teaching our kids how to search? How are we teaching them to vet through information when the world's information is out there? I mean, look at it from, you guys called out YouTube when we talked about my daughter, and the idea is we upload at Google 72 hours of video for every minute of YouTube video you watch, right? So no matter how hard your kids try, they'll never be able to watch all the videos, right? And my kids trying really hard to watch all of them, but they'll never be able to do it. So how do they find the right videos? How do they vet through the information? How do they use crowdsourcing? How do they, just like when we read a New York Times article, what's the first, at least I do, because this is the way I grew up, I look at who wrote it, right? And I have a perspective as to who wrote it. How do kids crowdsource and see who the reviewers are? Who are the people who are commenting? Which ones do they trust? Do they create a list of trusted users from a crowded source perspective so that they can actually use the information because it's in their perspective, right? So these are the things that we need to teach our kids how to do. We also have to realize that there's enough evidence that shows that we all learn in different ways, right? There's no questioning that anymore. When I was a kid and someone would explain something to me, they would yell at me when I didn't understand, and say, what do you need me to draw you a picture, right? And the answer today is what? Yes, I need you to draw me a picture. And so we all learn in different ways, and we have to use, technology gives us the opportunity to present content in lots of different ways. So we have to look at it that way, and also think about, have questions about what we're not even talking about yet in education in this movement, which is, if we all learn in different ways, it probably makes sense that we all test in different ways too. So doing a whole bunch of personalized testing and then bringing everyone into a room to take it and make them all take the same test probably doesn't make a lot of sense, right? So we're going to have to figure that out, and that's kind of what I think will be next in this discussion. And so how do we do this in an effective way in education? And so if we agree that education is critical, that technology in education is critical, and how do we do that? We're starting to see that be taken advantage of in lots of different ways, lots of different models, flipped classrooms, blended learning, distance learning, project-based learning. All these different things are only doable because of technology and the accessibility of technology. And it's getting cheaper and cheaper, right? And it's getting easier to use. I was at a conference in Atlanta, speaking at a conference this week, and in the bag they were giving out little trinkets, and one of the trinkets was an 8 gig flat thumb drive, right? And think about how, when I think about when I was a consultant at Accenture, and I was in my first or second year, I had my compact computer, and $5,000 machine, and it had a whopping 2 gig hard drive, right? And now we give away 8 gigs, right? A gig of information or a gig of hard drive used to cost $200,000 in 1980, right? That's how fast technology is moving for us. That's how the evolution of technology is getting us to a point where we can create all these new cool models in education that we're looking at. But we have to keep in mind that technology is just a tool, right? It's not something that is the silver bullet, right? We're not going to change education just because we use technology. We're not going to put machines in the classroom and say, "Oh, cool, everything's improved," right? It's just a tool. The New York Times beats up on technology in education, and I'm a big fan of the newspaper in general, but I'm actually going to be writing an op-ed piece for something that I just wrote last week, which is technology distracts kids, right? And it's this whole article. It's a great article about. It's a great illustration of the thinking that's going on, where teachers are saying, my kids can't pay attention to me. I can't get their attention. I can't hold their attention. They're distracted. As opposed to, this is the world that we live in. How do we adapt to it? Yeah?
So, I had this discussion in my classrooms, because I teach at the university level as well, to up-and-coming teachers how to use technology in their classrooms.
Right.
And that's what a lot of my students, even though they're really young, 18 to 20-year-olds, they still have the same argument. And I've always said to them, you're always going to have distractions in your classrooms. Doesn't matter whether there's technology or they're there or not.
Right.
There's a cute boy across the room. He's going to distract the girl over here.
Right.
There's a bird flying outside. There's
Right.
So utilize what they're using now and what they're familiar with, but teach them how to use it responsibly.
Right. Well, and also in your space, and I'm going to go into that a little bit, which is we have to change the models of what we're teaching teachers, right? I mean, they're expecting kids to be destructive and distracted because we're teaching them a different model. So we'll get into that. And the technology is there to support the content and the pedagogy that we use, not necessarily at the forefront. And so how do we go from this, where we see technology in class, to a whole system? Because it's hard. For those of us who are our family's tech support, right? I'm dreading December 26th when my in-laws get all their new technology, right? And I gotta go spend 9 hours dealing with their crap. With this, they got a new hard drive, they got a new computer, or this one got the new iPad, and this one got the new phone, and this one, and I have to go and set all that up, and I gotta go configure everything for them, and I turn into a marriage counselor by the end of the day, right? That's hard. How do we do that in the school system when you have 30 machines in the school? How do you go to 30,000? Can you imagine how hard that is? So we want to be able to look at a scalability model that is easy, that's as visible as possible, because we can't make it a pain in the butt, right? And so from our perspective, the first thing is that we have to look at is making sure that we have access. I'll tell you a funny story. We sell Chromebooks at Google, and we sold these Chromebooks there were Wi-Fi machines, and a school, this was a real person with a college degree, bought 30 machines for his school to try them out. And so we send him the 30 machines that he bought, and then we get an angry email from him saying, "You said these were Wi-Fi machines." And we're like, "Yeah, they're Wi-Fi machines. Like, they didn't come with Wi-Fi." Like, no. You actually have to have the broadband to use these machines. Oh, we don't have that. We want to send these back. Like, literally, that's the level of education that we still need to do in some of the education space, right? And so the first thing is making sure that we have access to broadband and making sure that we have the right tools available on the web. And this is a picture of a Google data center, and so this is the web, right? As unsexy as this is, unless you are a network guy or you develop servers, this is a Google data center. And this is the web. This is what the web looks like. And so we have to make sure that we can access that and that we have the right tools available for schools. And there's a lot of schools that don't have. 80% of the schools don't have adequate bandwidth right now for what's available today. Imagine what's going to be available 2 or 10 years from now. So we have to make sure that schools are prepared for that. And we have to make sure that the tools are going to come at us. From a Google perspective, we build tools for the billions. So these tools are going to be available and they're going to keep coming at you all the time. So it's getting out of the mind frame that we have to memorize all these things, that we have to be really, really good at it. Because we're the generation that the web was born into, as opposed to kids who the web was, they were born into the web, right? Because, at one point we thought we would get a grip on all the web, right? We thought we would understand how the web worked. We would understand that we would be able to memorize all the different websites, and we'd be able to use all those websites. And somebody would say, "Hey, there's this new website you should try out, and it's called Amazon.com." And you went online, and you're like, "Oh, Amazon.com, I can buy stuff. Cool. I have all 8 websites. I know the whole web now," right? And so you thought you'd memorize the whole thing, and then they kept coming at us. This generation of kids are growing up in a world where they understand and expect not to know everything, and so we have to kind of take that mind frame as well, that we're not going to know everything. We should just use what's available, use what we think works, and not worry about having to memorize everything and picking a first. When we get into this kind of we freeze, right? What's the best notebook application? What's the best this app? What's the best that app? And the answer is, it doesn't matter, right? It's finding something that works for you. Google Apps for Education is being used by 20 million plus users in the globe. I started Google Apps for Education at Arizona State University. Actually, if you look, people always wonder, how long I've been at Google and how long I've been in Phoenix, and you look at all the schools in Arizona. So ASU, U of A students, NAU, Grand Canyon, Thunderbird, Maricopa Community College, Pima Community College, Mesa public schools, they all use Google Apps. So in Arizona, we have a whole bunch of people using our tools, and across the world, we have about 20 million users using Google Apps for education, and that's really exciting for us because it's a great tool for infrastructure. It's a great tool to teach communication, collaboration skills, and lots of different things. We also have YouTube for schools, where we understand that not all, a lot of schools shut down YouTube or block YouTube, which, by the way, is a myth that you have to block YouTube, because you don't actually have to block YouTube. The Department of Education and the FCC have both said that you don't have to block YouTube. But that being said, we recognize that a lot of the content, a lot of comments weren't appropriate for schools, so we launched YouTube for schools. And so we have 900,000 videos for schools that are available, and it's all pure education videos that are available for schools. And they can actually open this up to their schools without actually having to worry about the content stuff on YouTube. And to your point, we have to develop great teachers, right? At the end of the day, it's still going to be about great teachers, but we have to recognize that the role of the teacher is changing. And so all of a sudden, the teacher used to be the person who stood in front of the room performing, and now we have to get them to be more of a facilitator, more of a coach. Most of us look at, even in the other world, where you look at people who work in any industry, and this is across all industries, the number one reason people leave their job is because of their manager, right? They have a bad manager. That's the number one reason across the board why somebody leaves their job. Well, think about when you had a good manager, right? What was that manager's role? That manager pushed you, coached you, mentored you, gave you room, made you work with others, gave you all the space. Like, it was a different type of role than someone who micromanaged you or just talked to you the whole time, right? And so the role of the teacher has to be more of like that great manager, and then maybe we won't necessarily worry about those distractions in the room. We'll figure out ways to utilize them instead, right? So we have to change the role of the teacher. At Google, we have a bunch of resources that are available. We have a community, we have training material, we have blogs, we have all the stuff that's available for teachers. We have a really, really cool, great community. My community manager, works with millions of teachers. We participate in lots of different ways, but we have to change the role of the teacher. And we also have to make sure that we pick the right tools so that we can scale. A bring your own device program isn't necessarily all that beneficial to me because it depends on how you define device. A device could be a MacBook Pro with Retina display, or it could be, a $40 smartphone, cheap Android smartphone that you bought from Beeper King, right? So those are not the same thing. Those are two different devices. And so we have to look at standardizing devices across the board so that they make them easy. And for Google, we created the Chromebook. I don't know if you're familiar with the Chromebook. The Chromebook manages and scales easy. You can actually put 10,000 or 100,000 in a school system, and you control them all from one location in the same way that you control Google Apps for education. So it makes them invisible in the classroom, and they boot up in 8 seconds, and you can set up the management console so that certain user groups do certain things. And so we're excited about the impact of Chromebooks in education and what we can do. And, none of this is easy. We're changing a paradigm shift. We're in the middle of a paradigm shift where education is changing to kind of be more around focus on making sure that learning happens all the time, that learning is not the current model that we currently have. So we have to look at it from a different perspective, and it gets really hard. Okay, questions that you guys have that I can answer for you, things that we're doing, Google related or otherwise. Yeah?
I live and work in Mexico, about 30 miles over the border at Douglas, and my question is, that digital divide thing. It's nice that all these tools exist, but if your average kid doesn't have access to even a basic computer with an old funky monitor,
sure.
I mean, how is Google doing anything about that, or how do we solve that? Once you plug the kids in, they learn just as fast as somebody who's from a first world country, but they have to get that stuff in their hands.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's a commodity issue for me, right? I think what's happening is, so even let's just look at the U.S., right? If you look at the U.S., if you make more than $75,000 a year, your kid at home has a 91% chance of having access to technology and having a web. If you make less than $30,000 a year, you have a 50% chance. So half of those kids aren't using computers at home or using the web.
Less than $5,000.
Yeah, but I'm just saying that just look at the U.S., right? I mean, we can get into global in a second, right? So if we look at that from just the U.S. perspective, if we're not bringing the technology into school, we're looking at half of our population that isn't learning these skills at all, isn't utilizing these skills at all. So from the U.S. perspective, that's why I want to see more of these technology in education. When we're looking at a global scale, again, what I'm seeing are pockets of really interesting things. If you look at places like, you're seeing these knowledge centers boom up in the slums in Nairobi, in the slums in Brazil, and slums in India, and there's like little pockets. If you look at a digital map and you see there's these learning communities that are growing, and what's the difference? The difference is that these communities, for some reason, got bandwidth, right? And they had a couple computers, and they're teaching each other with just a couple of computers and the web. And so I'm starting to see more and more of that. And again, it's a commodity thing where the cost of putting in fiber, the cost of putting in broadband, is dropping 100x every year, right? And so it's getting cheaper and cheaper. So I'm not necessarily worried about what the future holds because I see the potential and I see what we're having. There's places in Africa that are better Wi-Fi or better connected than Vermont. Right. But I'm saying like we're starting to see more and more of that. And so for us, we're experimenting in lots of different ways. For example, we just put in fiber in Kansas City, right? The first house went online. So there's a woman, we spotlighted her. There's a woman in Kansas City. Her house lives in an urban poor community. Her house has fiber. She's downloading at 959 megabytes per second and uploading at 979 megabytes per second. Like, can you imagine? She can download a movie in like a second, and that's a potential. And so we're making it cheap. We're figuring out the right cost model so that we can bring that to the rest of the world. So we're working on it. I mean, for us, you gotta look at the benefit. We want the world on the web, right? The more people use the web, the more technology that's out there, the better it is for us. So we have a huge interest in making sure that happens. It's just a time. How fast can we move?
Talking about 123 million jobs needed in high tech by 2020, 50 million qualified. What's happening? Why is this happening?
It's happening right now in lots of different spaces. We're not building really good STEM students, right? So if you look at the numbers, if you're let's say you're a Latino, a poor Latino in the United States, you have less than a 10% chance of actually graduating with a science degree, right? And so that's true for women, that's true for just general population. We're not graduating engineers, we're not graduating folks with math degrees, we're not graduating, and you go to college and become English majors, no offense to anyone who's an English major, they're not going into school and studying STEM. We don't have engineers. Like Google, we can't hire enough people. The critical thing to think about is we're a global organization now, and technology makes any organization a global organization, right? And one of the dangers of that is that we're going to hire engineers. We're always going to hire engineers. Where those engineers come from is up to us, right? And so we'll hire engineers in India or China or anywhere else, not China, but anywhere because that's where they come from. We need to grow them here. Right now, today, there's probably 6 million jobs that are open that we can't find Americans that qualify. Right? So that's where
is there a pool of people to meet that need globally for you?
So for us particularly, yes, because we're a global organization, so we can meet that. But we can't hire enough engineers, right? And this is just Google. And we get 2 million resumes a year, right? So imagine other smaller tech firms that are looking for engineers that can't find talent. In Silicon Valley, the unemployment rate is like 0.3%. Right? So that's the space. And then the other thing is that a lot of things are changing in terms of demographics, right? In North Dakota, you can go get a job at Subway for like $25 an hour. Right? They can't find anyone, right? So that's the space that we're finding ourselves into. We can't find
engineer, that's a big broad topic. So what specific kinds of engineers?
Software engineers. What we're looking for at Google is we hire really smart people in the engineering field, in the software engineering, really smart people who can code. And at some point in the very near future, it's not going to even matter where you go to school, because if you can code and you're good at it, we'll be able to assess that ourselves, right? And so that's what we're looking for in the software space, is people who can code.
See, because I also mentor kids going into college, and
I tell them the opposite. I tell them to go to college and learn how to code in any language, and don't worry about whether it's going to be obsolete. Because once you learn how to code, you know how to code. It's like learning a different language. And once you know how to speak a different language, or how a different language gets the infrastructure of a different language, you can learn how to speak any language. And so for us, we recognize that we're hiring people that can come in and do JavaScript, for example, or can code in C++. When they come in, if that's what they can know how to do, we want to make sure that they're smart, that they're curious, that they want to learn, because 6 months from now, they might be coding in a completely different language, and they have to learn how to do that.
Do they need a college degree for that?
Right now they do, but eventually we'll be able to do that assessment ourselves.
Okay, and then so my final question, I can talk forever. So they know how to code, they're engineers and all that, but there are those other skills, those great books, skills, they teach in classical liberal arts, people need to know how to put things in perspective, and they know that when they study the best that's ever been taught and spoken across the realm of human history. So how do you, there's a tension between the need to know that and then the need to have those technical skills. So how
you do both, right? And so most schools, you have your liberal arts classes that you take, and then you specify in a specific subject. You can take a bunch of liberal arts classes and still be a computer science major, or still be an engineer or software engineer major. You can do both. And the other thing is that learning doesn't stop. When you graduate from school, you learn different things. At Google, the old engineering joke: what's the difference between an introvert engineer and an extrovert engineer? The extrovert engineer looks at your shoes, right? We're teaching them social skills. We're teaching them, how presentation skills. Most of our senior folks or VPs are have engineering backgrounds that they're learning how to interact. So there are some of those things that are going to be continuous learning. The key thing for us is being able to find folks that are smart, they're curious, and that want to learn, right? And so that's what we're looking for. Other questions? Anything else? No?
Let's clap.
Thank you, guys. Yeah.
Is there a trend at all? Universities are way behind the curve on that. Would Google ever set up its own university at some point?
We've talked about that, and I think that more powerfully we can actually get more schools the resources that they need as opposed to. We even talked about building our own high school, and then we came to the conclusion that building a high school and graduating, 100 kids isn't scalable.
That's like a simple full of water.
Right. But if we can create like an open lab in one of our offices, for example, and have kids come in and rotate, we can affect 2,000 kids in every area. So it depends on how you look at it, but I think it comes down to making sure that we're teaching teachers how to be good teachers. And the truth is, most universities don't have the incentive to do that right now because they're cranking them.
Proprietary, they're like a priesthood, and the priesthood.
They're actually money-making machines.
That's all they are.
It's
you get a
literally
diploma, oh good, we got your money, but like is this graduate prepared for the world?
Right.
And you're going to be saying we need these kinds of people, but like,
right.
What's the incentive for them?
There is an incentive.
Although aren't you starting a university then? Universities don't respond.
But I think that with your for-profit universities, I think you're going to see a bigger change because they are being held accountable that there's a certain number of graduates that are getting jobs and are relevant and that kind of thing. But I don't see that as much with the public universities.
No.
So,
right.
I agree, no, that's
I think there's issues with both.
right.
So.
Yeah, the key thing is, I spoke to a couple of professors at ACU. I spoke at ACU a couple months ago, and at the School of Sustainability, and one of the premier, I can't think of his name, one of the premier professors in sustainability, we sat and had a conversation. And the first thing he said to me is, "We have record number of students. This is the most students we've ever had. Universities are the Walking Dead." And we don't realize it. And so you'll see these changes happen by force eventually. You'll start seeing these
like in
changes.
the meantime, you're asking kids to spend $20,000-$30,000 a year on tuition, and there might be much better, cheaper, more efficient ways to learn.
Absolutely.
They don't give you a diploma at the end.
And that's starting to change already, right? You're starting to see the trends in this space happening where you're starting to see disruption. There's a great book called Disrupting the Class, written by TechPHX, who's a little bit crazy, but Michael Horn's the other guy who wrote it. He's a cool guy, I know him. But the idea that disruption is going to come from nowhere. University is like, what's our competition? Our competition is, other universities, online learning, all this different thing. And it's going to hit them from from the underbelly. They're not going to see it, and so that's going to happen. It's happening now.
How do I counsel these young kids? It's like, don't get in debt, don't go to college, learn a different way. But how do they sort of prove that to someone?
I would say right now you still need that. You still need a piece of paper, right? And until that changes, fundamentally changes, I would still coach them that way. They still need to get a piece of paper. Do they need a piece of paper from Stanford or Harvard? It depends on what they want to do. It all comes down to what is it that they want to do with their life. Graduating from the Stanford Teaching College, when you come work in Arizona, you're still going to make $23,000 a year, whether you go to ASU or Stanford, right? And so
you're a kid from Harvard who graduated in May in linguistics, and she can't find a job, and she's bilingual, she's binational, and so what?
Right. Now, graduating from Stanford with a computer science degree
something like that,
is you make that money back in 2 years, right? And so there's a difference. What is it that you want to go to school for? Do you want to go to Stanford and be a physical education major, to be a teacher in physical education, or do you want to go to ASU or some other school where you can get that degree? So it really comes down to we used to be, and that conversation's already happening. Before it used to be, I don't care what you go study as long as you go to one of the top 20 schools. That conversation's already changed, and that's just in the last 10 years. Right?
So are you teaching?
It depends on what language you speak.
Yes.
My mother's from Argentina, and my father's originally from Syria, which makes me a very emotional, high energy, crazy person.
Shakira, she's from Colombia, but Lebanon.
Yeah. I belly dance just like she does.
Thanks.
Thank you. Great presentation.
Thanks. You guys got the intimate view. Usually it's like 500 people in the room, so you guys are lucky. I did. Yeah. Yeah, and actually, it's one of those things where you learn how to do these things over time, and everyone tries to put these these graphics together, and this arrow going into this arrow, and do different things, and nothing beats a picture. A picture is worth 1,000 words, right? And so for me, I think about what thought do I want to put on that? Like, what is it that I want to get out with the thought, and then what's the image for that thought? And so as long as you think of it that way, it's really easy to do it. It's cool. Yeah, cool. Yeah, thanks. Enjoy the rest of the day.
How much stuff do you do with the school at ASU? It sounds like you're coming